I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're listening to the only story that matters. It's one story written by one guy and recorded in one single, flawless take. This episode of SKALD picks up right where the last one left off. But you don't need to worry about starting at the beginning. Just jump right in here. Afterward, once you're hooked, you can find out what you've missed by checking out the previous episodes of the podcast or by picking up the prose volumes, available exclusively on Amazon. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, part 76. Ho felt his soul quake as he walked through the crystal door, the one glowing with that jaundiced yellow light, the light that spoke to the worst part of him, the most neglected, beaten down part of him, spoke to it, soothed it, and fortified it. As he passed the threshold, following in the vermin prince's footsteps, he had to reach out, had to place a hand on the doorway to steady himself, to steel himself against the light and what it promised, because he could not tell what it wanted more. To lay him low or to raise him up on high. As he passed through, as he followed close behind the shuffling, limping vermin prince, the feeling abated, as did the yellow light, which was replaced by the same crisp, clean whiteness that had lit the hallways, a light that was ever so slightly tinted with a nauseating pink. And as Ho wrangled his nerves, as he struggled to rein in the twisting, turning feeling that had overtaken his stomach, he made note of where they were. A throne room. They had entered from the rear. Such practices, Ho remembered from his childhood lessons, were not uncommon for the kings of old. But they had been done away with by Caleria, who, though she ran the city, ran her city with an iron fist, though she was one in all but name. She styled herself not as queen, but as the Lady of Ravenna. For Ho's former student, for Mouse, for the vermin prince, such an entrance was not unusual. To make his way into his throne room by some unique, private path. But for Ho, this was clearly a departure from the norm, as evidenced by the shocked, horrified, and concerned faces that filled the room. The vermin prince made his way to his throne, less a throne and more a stool, a simple wooden chair placed in the midst of countless artifacts and offerings, half-burned candles, broken baubles, shattered glasses, and other remnants of an affluent life, a life so luxurious that such treasures could be thoughtlessly thrown away. And as he did so, as the ruler took his place, Ho stood awkwardly, and he looked out at the vermin prince's subjects. Their confusion shone through faces covered in dirt, sweat, blood, tears, and worse. They were orphans and runaways, cripples and the destitute. They were those that Ravenna had no place for, no room for in its constant, frantic efforts to maintain its borders, to guard the territories that it had, in the ecstasy of hubris, seized for itself so many years ago. These cast-offs, these poor souls, these, hated to even think the word, but he knew that it was apt, and what's more, that it was a title they relished, one they had reclaimed for themselves. These vermin, they had been discarded by the city that had birthed them, by the world that had broken them, and they, spiraling the drain, rushing through the gutters, they had ended up here, in the court of the vermin prince. Now, the vermin prince's subjects gazed out at Ho through beady eyes that distrusted anyone less filthy, less sordid, less debased than themselves. And Ho, even in his current state, even covered in filth, even battered by his former colleague, even exhausted and drained from ecstasy of spirits and of the spirit, he was clearly not one of them. But Ho wasn't the only one who stood out in that throne room. There was one who looked even more out of place than him, one that stood up straighter, whose clothes were less stained, whose eyes had none of the seething hatred and resentment contained in those of the vermin prince's subjects. No, because amongst the vermin prince's followers, his people, his limping, boil-covered army, there stood a high elf. Or at least, that's what Ho thought she was. No, that's what Ho knew she was. He himself had never seen an elf of any kind, never seen the elusive Farah, and never had the misfortune of laying eyes upon a high elf. They had been banished from Ravenna ever since the fall, since the cataclysm that tore out the city's foundation, but in doing so had anointed Ravenna's new leader, the clever, ruthless protege of the twin wizards, the sorceress, the witch, the Lady of Ravenna, Caleria. It had been years before Ho's birth. Many, many years. But he had heard the tales, the ones that had made it through the subsequent decades. Caleria, in a spout of flame, had immolated the vicious brute that had come so close to victory, had almost succeeded in his simple, hateful goal, had almost destroyed Ravenna, almost brought that beacon of civilization crumbling down to the earth, where savagery could once again reign supreme. Years before the centaurs had increased their ranging, before they smashed against Caleria's walls, this monster, this barbarian, this destroyer had himself sought to crush the city under his thick, calloused heel. But Caleria had stopped him. She had defeated him, destroyed him utterly, and in so doing, she had saved the life of Enlith, queen of the High Elves. And with Enlith in her debt, Caleria offered her a deal. In exchange for her life, in exchange for not meeting the same fiery end that had taken the barbarian destroyer, Enlith was asked to promise never to return to that border realm and to forbid her followers from doing the same. And Enlith, with the royal line of her hereditary enemies, the Farah, decimated, with her fated rival, the brutish savage, immolated. She had agreed. A high elf should not have been in that throne room. A high elf should not have been anywhere in that border realm. And yet, there she was. And Ho should not have been able to identify her as such, having only heard secondhand tales of secondhand tales of secondhand tales of their legendarily cold and severe beauty. And yet, he knew, deep within him, that the stoic figure with the pointed ears, the one that nodded at him knowingly as he gaped around the room, that she was, without a doubt, a high elf. You took so long to come to me. Ho was shaken out of his reverie, out of his astonished staring, by the words of the vermin prince, he who sat proudly upon his simple, unadorned throne, gazing out at the followers whose hateful glances softened as they looked upon their Messiah. You took so very long. But finally, you're here. He gestured at one of his followers, who rushed forward with a rug that he spread out upon the ground to the vermin prince's left. Please, have a seat. I know how difficult your journey has been. Ho obeyed, folding his legs and lowering himself down onto the worn and stained rug. And as he did so, the vermin prince smiled and then beckoned. The high elf. Harana, please, join my former master. Join Ho in the seat of honor. That elegant, fair-skinned high elf nodded silently, then made her way to the rug, moving in a motion that was more like floating than walking. She then took a seat next to Ho, placing herself uncomfortably close to him. And as she sat there in stoic, scheming silence, she stared holes in the confused, exhausted, filthy man next to her. We are most fortunate to have Harana amongst us. She is an emissary from the realm of the High Elves, an ambassador from Queen Enlith, who has graciously agreed to lend her support to our cause. Ho, struggling not to stare back at the High Elf ambassador, stammered his reply. Your cause? The vermin prince looked out at the followers that continued to crowd into the throne room, taking their measure, judging them for what was to come. It is good that you're here, Ho. It is so good that you are finally here. He then turned back to face his former master. I've been watching you, Ho. I have longed for you to come to me, longed for you to join me. But I needed for it to be of your own accord. Ho looked around, watching, confused, as the vermin prince's subjects milled about and repositioned themselves according to some unknown logic. I don't understand. Why have you brought me here? The vermin prince closed his eyes, and he breathed in slowly. There is much you do not know, and there is even more that you need to understand. He paused, and then opened his eyes once again. But it is better that you be shown rather than told. As he continued on, the subjects of the vermin prince hoisted a series of poles up into the air. Long, worn, broken, and repaired poles, at the end of which hung the same simple, crude iron thuribles that had decorated the altar room. Hung in the others, they went through so much less than you did. Their paths were so much easier, and yet they came to me first. They joined with me so many years ago. And yet, you, my master, my former master, still, you resisted. The poles began to wave back and forth erratically, in a pattern that Ho could not recognize, but shocking himself, he found that he could predict. As he watched, slowly giving in to their hypnotizing effect, the vermin prince reached out and touched his shoulder gently, breaking his trance. But it was important to me. It was so important to me that you be here. You more than anyone else. You who first tore my eyes open to the reality of the world around us, though you only showed me shadows of the truth. Still, you showed me more than anyone else ever had, more than anyone else was willing or able. Ho watched as his former student's gaze softened, as the beadiness of his eyes receded, and Ho, once again, for ever so brief a moment, saw not the vermin prince, but the boy, the eager pupil, Mouse. But just as quickly as his former student arrived, he disappeared, and all that was left was the vermin prince. But you're here now. That is what is important. And you're just in time to see firsthand, to see how I reward my followers. The Vermin Prince looked up and he clapped his hands, at which point the crowd's murmuring ceased instantaneously. After a moment of silence, he then, favoring his ruined right leg as always, forced himself to his feet. Who comes? Who comes to offer fealty to the Vermin Prince? From deep within that still growing crowd, a simple, exhausted, defeated voice rang out, a voice that, while meek and tired, still held within it a bold note of defiance. I do. The crowds parted, making way for a frail, middle-aged man with a hunched back and a burlap sack slung over it. And as he shuffled forward, the Vermin Prince spoke to him gently. What is your name, friend? The man stopped, stared at his feet, the ones covered not with shoes, but with strips of filthy cloth, and then, mustering every ounce of courage in his broken, used-up body, he raised his head, and he locked eyes with the Vermin Prince. My name is Garn. Ho felt something tingling his throat, then looked up to see that the thuribles, the ones that hung and swayed over their heads, had begun to spew out their thick, pink smoke, a heavy smoke that sunk to the ground almost as soon as it was expelled by the swinging censers. And what have you brought me, Garn? Garn bit his lip, and he spoke. I have brought you all that I have left, all they left me with. The crowd murmured their distaste until the Vermin Prince raised his hand and continued. What did they take from you, Garn? Garn clenched his teeth and then continued on. Everything. They took everything. They took my son to fight the centaurs, and then the centaurs, Ho's heart broke as the poor man's eyes welled up with tears. The centaurs, they took my son from me again. Took him the second time. Took him the final time. The Vermin Prince's face hardened, hatred washing over it. And what else, Garn? She, Caleria, the Lady of Ravenna, the witch. The crowd began to hiss. She said she needed my shop. I was a toy maker. I made toys for children. And what did she do, Garn? She kicked me out. She cast me out into the street with no way to provide for myself, with no options, with no hope. And your shop? She gave it to them, to the proctors. She had them run it for her, but she didn't make toys. No joy came from my shop ever again. Why, Garn? Tell me. They repurposed it. They took my tools, my supplies, and they made weapons. Weapons. Cheap, crude clubs and spears, as disposable as those that wielded them. The Vermin Prince raised his hands high, at which point the thuribles began swinging faster, began to spit out more and more of that noxious pink smoke, heavily laced with the stench of putrefaction. And as the room filled with smoke, the Vermin Prince spoke, his voice weighed down with venom. And what did you bring me, Garn? In a single motion, Garn upended his sack, dumping its contents upon the floor. The aged mementos, family heirlooms, and what was left of his former life, the toys that he had made since he was a child, they fell upon that smooth stone floor, and they scattered at Garn's feet. I bring you everything. Everything I have left. I require everything. Garn reached into a hidden pocket, buried in the rags that he clothed himself in, and when he pulled out his hand, he held a simple piece of parchment covered in barely literate, barely legible scribbling. The deed to my home. There's none left to live in it now anyway. My wife, when Yoren went to the front. Garn began to choke up. He lowered his head, struggling with his misery. But the Vermin Prince wasn't through. Garn, I require everything. You have it. I have nothing else left. No, you have that which is most precious. You have fear. It is yours. You have resentment. It is yours. You have hate. It's yours. It's yours. And you, Garn, you have value. Garn, taken by some frenzy, given over to some irresistible passion, he rent his garments, he tore them off of his pitiful body, sagging with age and desperation. It's yours. It's all yours. I give you everything because I have nothing else to give and no one to give it to. I accept your gift. I treasure it. A sweet, comforting smile stretched across the Vermin Prince's countenance. And I treasure you, Garn. O looked around the room, looked at the soiled faces, the ones that watched intently, that looked on in breathless anticipation, knowing, fearing, and lusting after what would come next. And as he panned the room, he locked eyes with his fellow honored guest, the high elf Harana, who shot him a wicked grin before turning her gaze back to Garn. As Garn stood there, shaking from the cold, quivering from all that he had lost and all that he had given, the Vermin Prince limped toward him, the noxious pink smoke clearing a path for that uncrowned ruler. But before I can give you my gift, before I can give you what you need, what you deserve. The smile vanished from the vermin prince's face. You must say the words. Face to face with him, standing naked in the vermin prince's throne room, surrounded by his followers, the orphans and the runaways, the cripples and the destitute, the ones that still filed into the room, packing every corner with squalid bodies and sordid clothes, filling the throne room with a stench that could only be banished by that pungent pink smoke. Standing there, Garn was transfixed, unable to comply, unwilling to run. He stood there, silent and shaking, hot tears of loss and ecstasy streaming down his face. Say the words, Garn. You already believe them. You already know them to be true. They've always been true, before you even knew it. The vermin prince raised his voice, barking at the broken man. Say them, Garn! Say the words! Say who you serve and what you deserve! Garn looked around, looked at the faces of men, women, and children who, just like him, had lost everything, had never been given anything, and had, in their misery, in their destitution, agreed to accept the gift of this man, this glorious man. He turned back to face the vermin prince, his eyes clear, the conflict in his heart resolved, the distrust in his soul banished. And he spoke. I serve the vermin prince, and I am no longer content with scraps. No sooner were the words spoken than the pink smoke began to coalesce at Garn's feet. And as that terrible phrase still echoed through the throne room, the pink smoke began to climb up his legs. At first, Garn accepted it. He welcomed it. But as the smoke wrapped him tighter and tighter, as it grew thicker and thicker, he began to struggle. His eyes went wide with fear, and his voice cried out in terror, in unhinged horror, until the smoke squeezed the breath out of him and covered his head. Garn fell to the ground, a writhing pink cocoon, a groaning, spasming abomination, a larval state, an intermediate step, an abhorrent evolution, but to what? Ho could not say, did not want to say. And as he watched in horror and disgust, as he felt his stomach turn and fill with the caustic, burning bile, he saw her out of the corner of his eye. Harana, the High Elf ambassador, was laughing. Thanks for checking out the best episode of SKALD yet. Normally, this is the part of the show where I read a SKALD review, either of the podcast or for the prose volumes. But there's a problem. I've run out of reviews. Right now, there are 44 SKALD reviews on iTunes, which sounds great until you consider that there are thousands and thousands of people downloading SKALD each and every week. I don't even want to do the math to figure out what low percentage of SKALD listeners actually leave reviews, because I am sure that it would bum me out in a serious way. especially since iTunes reviews are the #1 with a bullet best way for DIY shows like SKALD to find their audience. Please, please take a few minutes and leave a review for the only story that matters. You've heard about the newest goal on the SKALD Patreon, right? Once we hit $250 a month, which we're less than $100 away from, I'm going to start playing live music intros and outros for the show. And I'll be doing it with the only instrument that's weird and psychedelic enough for SKALD. An awesome synth that I'm practicing with daily. Hit up patreon.com/SKALD to help us reach this goal and make SKALD that much weirder and more awesome. As always, I am completely indebted to you, the SKALD fanbase, for helping to keep this show going and growing. But there's a lot more growth to be had. So please, keep telling all your friends and family about the only story that matters. Tell your Dungeons & Dragons groups, post it on message boards and Reddit, tweet about it, scream it from the rooftops so everyone you know knows to check it out. And if you want to tag me in it, go for it. I'm Aubrey Sitterson on all social media. Or hit up AubreySitterson.com for links to everything, including my comics work, bio, contact information, and more. By the time this episode airs, the game will have been out for a while. But seriously, I cannot recommend No Man's Sky enough. There's no real story, no real objectives, and honestly, that's exactly what makes it so very great. It's a massive, sprawling, fascinating, gorgeous world to get lost in. It's meditative and relaxing and just all around awesome. Try playing it with SKALD in the background and imagine that you're traversing the sundered worlds. You'll dig it. I promise. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.